It's the Believe in Texans podcast brought to you by FanDuel, where right now on FanDuel, Texans are still plus 2,000 to win the Super Bowl. Look, we know what this is all about. It's CJ Stroud and everything else surrounding him, which brings us to this dopamine hangover that we're in the week after the draft. You got high hopes for everybody that they drafted. I'm happy with the Texans draft, but reality sinks in and you remember, oh yeah, as it is with every single team in the NFL right now, there are questions. So I've got 12 lingering concerns about the Houston Texans in the post-draft week. Not that I'm alarmed about, but things that need to be addressed or things that are very undetermined as of now until we see how some of these rookies play. And I think first and foremost, because this has been the focus of discussion for so much of the last several years, it's did they actually fix the offensive line or did they just reshuffle it? Because, man, they've made some additions. Traded away Titus Howard and Juice Scruggs. You add Wyatt Teller, draft Keelan Rutledge, and Fabechi Wee-Woo. And it's a lot of movement, but I think it's still a fair question of did they fill all of these spots in with the right guys? You know, free agency can be dicey in the NFL, even with the top tier guys. And you brought in Wyatt Teller, who I love, but who's older and who's had injury concerns. Braden Smith, who's going to be entering a new system. You don't know what you're going to get from your draft picks until they show up and perform. And there's still a lot of unsettled questions until they go out and prove it on the field. This is as optimistic as I've been, though, in a long time, in looking forward to the first day of training camp, where the last few years, the first day of training camp has been it's been kind of a slaughter. It's frankly, it's like R-rated content, not suitable for children when you see what the defensive line has been able to do to the offensive line in practice during training camp. And people would try to make excuses for him and say, well, it's a new scheme, it's a new system, it's a new coach. They're not allowed to cut block. Offensive linemen make that excuse all the time. Well, when we can't cut block, it's a lot harder, right? But you don't have to look like you're a vague hint of a speed bump as Mario Edwards looks like an all-pro in training camp. So did they fix the offensive line? We'll find out soon enough, and I'll have a good feel for it within the first couple weeks of camp. If I'm seeing actual battles going on between the offensive line and that absolutely ferocious defensive line. The second concern, and I made this separate from the O-line overall because I don't want to neglect it, but it's that center is still very unsettled. We feel like we know who the starters are going to be at the other positions. It's center. You've got Jake Andrews, but then you've got four other guys who either have played a little bit of center or might project to center or are named centers on the depth chart. So between Keelan Rutledge, where there's a very good chance I think he starts off the season at center, but it's a projection because he's only played a little bit of it at the Senior Bowl. You've got Jake Andrews, you've got Jarrett Patterson who can play center, you've got Eli Cox, you've got Evan Brown. Those are just the five guys that without digging into City Sal's background or anything, might be competing for that starting center spot. I'm not as concerned about this because if it's Jake Andrews or if it's Keelan Rutledge or Fabechi Wee-Woo, he's played center. He played 3 games at center at the end of his career. So 6 guys at least that could potentially be centers. It's a lot easier to be a good center when you've got veteran guards next to you. We saw that with Jake Andrews last year when Titus Howard came down and played guard. And Titus Howard wasn't the perfect solution at guard, but all of a sudden when you've got Ed Ingram and Wyatt Teller, and Titus Howard next to Jake Andrews, he was able to function a lot better. And a lot of these mental errors and blown assignments that we saw in the first half of the season kind of fell by the wayside. So I'm not as concerned about it, but I am very curious who the starting center is going to be in week 1. Right now on FanDuel, the Texans are plus 950 to win the AFC. That hasn't changed at all either. There's one team that's above the Texans that's really annoying me right now, but plus 950 on FanDuel right now. Number 3, and depending on how you want to define capital, it could be draft picks, it could be actual money, and I think it's a little bit of both. They spent premium capital on projections. So if you go into the draft, Marlon Klein, I see his upside, but it is very raw. And if you think about, okay, other guys, no matter where you had tight ends on your board, there's other guys that you could see maybe fit more quickly into an NFL offense. And when it seems like they really want to lean into this trend in the NFL where you go really heavy on the tight ends, play with 3 tight end sets, 13 personnel a bunch of the time, that there's still a lot of unproven guys there at tight end, or at least question marks. Foster Moreau, like Dalton Schultz obviously is there, but then Foster Moreau, he can block. He is a viable receiving threat. I think he makes the roster just because they need at least one guy that they know is capable of blocking. But between Marlon Klein, Cade Stover, Brevin Jordan, Luke Lachey, Lane Pryor, those are the guys on the roster right now. I'm not exactly sure which guy's going to emerge as a threat. Brevin Jordan is an obvious threat and kind of a unique guy as long as he can stay healthy. But you also have to remember that his career high in receiving is, it was less than 300 yards. I want to say it's about 240 yards a couple of years ago. So it's not like this is an electrifying threat that adds to the tight end group. I'm cool with the Rutledge pick. I trust that they trusted their process. You draft, not looking at this year necessarily, but into the long term. But for this year, there's still a lot of question marks about the tight end position, and that the Texans spent a high draft pick on a guy that, whether or not you think he's overdrafted, is still a projection. So you just gotta close your eyes, drive over the cliff with Thelma and Louise, and hope that Nick knows what he's doing. Kids, look up Thelma and Louise. It's got a ending that it's probably not the best example I could have used because pretty sure they died. But still, the attitude and the spirit I'm talking about. Number 4. This is as I think about CJ Stroud and as I avoid talking about him because there's things that we just don't know about CJ Stroud until he gets in here. You are still asking CJ Stroud to improve while adjusting to a lot of new pieces on offense. So there's going to be a burn-in period. David Montgomery, I love him. As long as he's healthy and everything, I think he's going to be great. But there's going to be a burn-in period where he gets comfortable with this offense. I think if you look at the tight ends, if you look at, wide receiver is pretty much set. But the offensive line, you've got a lot to wonder and worry about, just with everything we talked about early on with the offensive line. So that remains one of the biggest factors. But how does CJ, as he seems to be continuing to grow in his leadership role, he's been calling new additions to the team. He's doing all the right things the way he has been all these other off seasons. This is where him missing OTAs last year, we tried to brush it off like it was no big deal. I'd be really upset, not with CJ, but just because of the circumstance. If for some reason he couldn't participate in every single OTA this offseason, because this offense has a lot of moving parts to begin with, and CJ wants to be able to direct a lot of it in terms of pass protection. He's got to be just an ultimate leader in terms of getting all those guys on the same page. Number 5, the run game. Going back to David Montgomery. Is it actually solved? A lot of this comes back to the offensive line. Everything comes back to the offensive line eventually, and CJ Stroud. But Montgomery gives them toughness. He gives them an identity. They trade the trade compensation I'm fine with, but did they genuinely improve the run game up to the point where it's at the very least a middle-of-the-road NFL rushing offense? I think they made a lot of headway towards that in the second half of last season. They still finished the season as one of the worst defenses in the league by EPA and all of those metrics. And it's really hard for a young quarterback without a viable rushing attack to really put his best foot forward and to be a competitive, just a genuinely solid quarterback. It's the one really valid excuse. If you're feeling down, if you're feeling like what's the meaning of football and life, know that CJ, for whatever his strengths and weaknesses were in the playoffs, it's really, really hard to operate if you're not capable of running the football. And you might point to examples of, hey, this quarterback does just fine without a great rushing attack. There's a difference between not running the ball and not being capable of running the ball. Like the Chiefs are way more capable of running the football than you would guess by the way that Andy Reid operates. But that's just Andy Reid. If Andy Reid were inclined to run the ball more, including sometimes in games where the Chiefs really are having a hard time passing the football and Chiefs fans wonder, why the hell are we not running the ball? Like, you're running the ball at will. Why do you not do it? They're capable of running the ball. The Texans have not been capable of running the ball. So, yes, it's all very much tied to the offensive line. It's also tied to Woody Marks continuing to progress. Woody Marks being a dual threat and a guy that you can unsettle a defense a little bit by not knowing whether he's going to carry the ball or when he's going to receive the ball. And then Woody Marks just simply being able to stay healthy. It was a big adjustment for a rookie running back thrust into that position, especially for a smaller guy. And, hopefully he's just better equipped and more just physically ready for that test this year, because it gets kind of sparse behind those two guys, and running backs do tend to get injured. Jawar Jordan, Noah Whittington, Josh Pitzenberger. Those last two guys are undrafted free agents, if you didn't recognize the name. And then British Brooks, who I put at fullback. British Brooks and his evolution from running back / fullback / tight end. That'll be really interesting to watch. I think they still think he has upside there, and he's a special teams contributor. So if he makes the team because of special teams, there's still room for him to develop as a runner. And Agumbawale, for whatever it's worth, is still out there as a free agent. It feels like Agumbawale is going to be on this team in some way, shape, or form until the time he's 49 years old. That'll be a story for the ages. Number 6, wide receiver depth. Still feels tenuous. So I'm really optimistic about Jaden Higgins. I think Jaden Higgins had a better rookie season than a lot of people realize. There's some great clips of Steve Smith Sr. out there who's just absolutely in love with Jaden Higgins. We saw both with him and Jalen Knoll that there was a learning curve last year. Higgins latched on and ascended the learning curve more quickly than Jalen Knoll did. But I think part of what held Jalen Knoll back in the second half of the season was the existence of Christian Kirk. So that those two guys are still, you got to see it in their second year. You got to be sure that there's no sophomore slump. And then the biggest wild card of all is just Tank Dell. And where is Tank Dell right now? I'm optimistic that he's going to practice. I'd be really surprised if he doesn't practice. How far can he get back to his physical prime? The biggest thing he's got going for him is that guys that come back from catastrophic knee injuries like that tend to do it when they're younger, when they're on the lower side of 25 years old. And he still has youth on his side. He doesn't have a whole bunch of extra body weight that's going to make it that much more taxing on the joint. But he might be the biggest wild card of all on this offense, and whether they can regain some explosiveness, because he's obviously, despite his limited numbers in his second year, he's very much capable of taking the top off of a defense. And that the game where he got injured, I mean, he was on pace to have one of the best games of his season. We saw very much on the very play when he got injured just how devastating he could be as a downfield threat. I think he's a little bit of a security blanket for CJ, even though CJ didn't have a chance necessarily to exploit it a lot in Tank Dell's last season. It's just that one extra guy that he feels like he's got a little bit of that sixth sense ESP connection with. You mix it in with some other good wide receivers, and I hope we see the best version of Tank Dell. If we look at the draft picks at wide receiver, the intriguing guy is Lewis Bond out of BC, obviously. The thing that I find most intriguing about him is, like, look, he's a chain mover. He's a smaller guy. He's quicker than he is fast, all of those old cliches. But he's played in Bill O'Brien's offense, and there's going to be some similarities in concepts and terminology to what he had in college, and that maybe for slot receivers where it's a big step. We saw this in Jalen Knoll last year. Slot receiver, you almost have to mentally think about the game like you're a quarterback. You got to read coverages. You got to adjust to leverage. You got to do all these things. Those are some of the things that Jalen Knoll was having a tough time adapting to, I suspect, early on. Maybe by rookie standards, Lewis Bond ends up being a nice surprise as a 6th-round draft pick. The one team that annoyed me on here was the Lions, because the Lions, when it comes to the odds, are plus 900 to win the. Oh, it doesn't annoy me. I apologize. It doesn't annoy me, but it reminds me that the Texans are kind of entering that territory of where are you in the evolution of your team. The Lions were a couple years ahead of the Texans, and that they were a team that's, oh boy, look at that. They're knocking at the door. Now all of a sudden they're at the point where they've got to pay a lot of these guys, a lot of that young talent, and they've had to let guys like David Montgomery go. And David Montgomery is obviously a very big culture fit, which brings us to number 7. Are they relying too much on culture fit as a scouting tiebreaker? And this is something that I always feel dirty even admitting, because I love the way they put an emphasis on culture. I've talked about this on this channel and on my on sports radio and on my YouTube stream about how much I believe in D'Amico and his ability to set a culture. And a lot of coaches talk about it, but then they make decisions that end up making them look hypocritical. They keep guys around and pay guys who don't fit the culture and then expect the young guys to somehow ignore the example set by the non-culture setter. I do believe D'Amico's awesome at building an incredible culture, and I think they have that there. But then you wonder, all right, when Nick has said multiple times they have a smaller draft board than other teams, are you missing out sometimes on guys that maybe would eventually fit the culture? Maybe they do fit the culture because they got a bad rap in college, but they're also really, really explosive. They're really exciting athletes. I have a really hard time knowing where to draw the line on that. You know, a lot of people would say, a lot of people that have been on Super Bowl winning teams, et cetera, will say, yeah, you got to have a couple knuckleheads on your team. Like I have a tolerance for at least 2 or 3 knuckleheads. They don't have to be on the team forever, but they can be a part of a championship culture as long as you've only got 2 or 3 knuckleheads. You get start to get too many knuckleheads, there's a tipping point where all of a sudden you fall off a cliff, the Thelma and Louise style, with all of your knuckleheads. I don't know if they have a knucklehead right now. And yeah, that's a point of concern. I might have added that as a 13th thing, but I need at least one knucklehead on this team. Number 8. This might surprise some of you. I'm really happy about the Cade McDonald pick. Really, really happy about it. But the defensive line needs more help, and they need it at the end position. Because if you look at Denico Autry and Derek Barnett, those guys combined for about 500 or so, give or take, snaps during the regular season. And Derek Barnett had 5 sacks. Denico Autry was a huge presence on field goal block. The Texans didn't just block a lot of kicks. They had the highest miss rate by field goal kickers in the league. So even if they didn't block it, you know, D'Amico said this on Texans All Access. He really thinks that the psychological fear that you put into a field goal unit between the kicker, the holder, and the snapper, when they know that Denico Autry's got a really good knack for blocking field goals out there, it just might gum up their process enough that creates a lot of missed picks. So the edge rusher position right now, if we look at the backups, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of upside. Dylan Horton played more snaps last year than a lot of people realize. He was playing between 20 and 30 snaps pretty regularly. And I like his presence as a combination run defender and also a pass rusher. I do wonder what his upside is. Solomon Byrd, I like him. He's not necessarily an explosive guy. He's a crafty guy. He was really polished even 2 years ago when he was a rookie. But the other guy, Dominique Robinson, who comes over from Chicago, he has that incredible athleticism, but he's very much a curiosity in terms of, man, was really raw. There's upside there in him somewhere. And maybe between Rod Wright coaching him and just him being in a different system, maybe a scheme that fits him more perfectly, maybe they get something out of him. But I'd like them to look outside the building at this point. I think Joey Bosa is still out there. He's probably going to go somewhere where he can be a starter. The guys like, AJ Epinesa, various other defensive ends, there's not anything really thrilling. So that might come via trade at some point between now and week 1. Number 9, linebacker. Now you might say, Seth, wait a second. They just re-signed or extended Aziz Al-Shaair. Everybody loves Aziz Al-Shaair. Yes, they did. Henry To'oTo'o is still entering the final year of his contract. And I think between those two guys, the one thing that D'Amico's missing in this defense that he had when he was in San Francisco is guys that are awesome at stopping the run, but also impressive in coverage. Guys that can kind of increase the bubble around them and make it easier for defensive backs. And they don't quite have that right now. The Wade Woodaz draft pick in the 4th round, he's a guy who's really intriguing. I don't think you're probably going to see him real early on. I think that Aziz Al-Shaair and Henry To'oTo'o are going to be the starters. But the depth there, if you have injuries, is great. They've got EJ Speed, and EJ Speed does great things on special teams. He does really impressive things when he does play in a relatively limited number of snaps. But we saw when Aziz got hurt last year against the Raiders, man, we had some issues at the linebacker position. They missed Aziz Al-Shaair, and Henry To'oTo'o had the worst game of his season when he's thrust into a different role and a different set of expectations. So this is, again, none of these are things where I'm just trying to be Chicken Little and act like this is the end of the world if they don't fix this. But there's still, we need Wade Woodaz, hopefully, over the next couple of years to develop and become more than just a special teamer. Number 10, and this is another one I feel dirty about, but it needs to be said. The Texans have one of the best secondaries in the league, especially with Reed Blankenship now. They've got 5 guys across the board that you feel really good about. We still have questions about the depth. And last year, where they were really lucky, or at least they did a good job of preventing injuries in the secondary, we saw what happened when Kamari Lassiter went down. And in terms of guys that you have as an option on the outside, Jalen Smith, I don't know how much, if he comes along, you're still waiting to see what he has as he comes back from his knee injury, and how much do you trust him on the outside? And then at safety, I'm not going to mess up his name. Kamari Ramsey. Come on. I've got such a hard time. I'm going to have a hard time with Kamari Lassiter and Kamari Ramsey. I think Kamari Ramsey's intelligence and his football IQ and his studiousness being such a big part of his scouting report makes me feel good about, okay, you know what? Maybe this kid can come in and be a jack of all trades. And if Jalen Petrie goes down, maybe he's a guy that can go in and fill in for Jalen Petrie in his role. If Reed Blankenship or Kalen Bullock goes down, maybe you can go in there. Jalen Reed is still coming along. He was banged up and injured all last year, so we didn't get really a really good chance to look at Jalen Reed. As far as the safety position in general, I feel 100% about it, 100% better about it than I did last year. Because Jalen Ramsey, let's remember, he's not a safety. So the safety position last year was Kalen Bullock and then a bunch of different dudes. So that ended up losing you some football games. If we go from Jimmy Ward to CJ Gardner-Johnson onto 4 or 5 different players that played in that role afterwards, it was never ideal. So the presence of Reed Blankenship makes me feel way better about the overall breadth of the secondary at this point. Number 11. The draft did not obviously add a game-breaking offensive weapon. And this is something I'd seen people mention it, and it's true. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but the needs on the offensive line were so extreme. And I think in terms of the defense being a truly complete defense for what D'Amico wanted, there's really a place for Caden McDonald that I think a lot of people didn't realize this, but it's really nice at times to have a big 330-pound space occupier on the defensive line. It allows everybody else to play more aggressively, but it makes you more stout in those situations where you absolutely have to stop the run. But beyond that, it was, man, they got to address the offensive line. Tight end was a position of need. We need so many things to make this offense better. And yet they didn't really necessarily add to the explosiveness of the offense. I'm cool with that, except for, the question marks that still linger about wide receiver, tight end, depth at running back, all of those things. I think you could have added wide receivers. You could have added a running back. You could have added, Jadarian Price or something. And I don't think it would make as big an impact as simply fixing the offensive line. And you might say, well, why'd you have to draft multiple offensive linemen? Because a bunch of them are going to play, and a certain percentage of your draft picks aren't going to work out. So just taking swings at the plate until they fix the offensive line, I'm cool with that, but it's still, something that you have to mention about what you did and did not accomplish in the draft. And the 12th one, and this is just kind of the overarching theme going into the season, is that, man, all right, we've been to the divisional round a few times now, still haven't broken through that ceiling of the divisional round, but the margin of error is a lot more narrow now. That Detroit Lions territory that we talked about, the Texans are in that spot. The money they've spent on defense with extensions is pretty healthy. Most of those extensions don't kick in for a couple years. It doesn't start to hurt you against the cap necessarily. So the Texans are still in pretty good cap position over the next couple of years. But at some point here, well, you still are paying your rookie on his rookie contract. Because remember, even if CJ gets an extension, the big money isn't going to kick in for another couple of years. So you'll still have a rookie quarterback. You've still got room to sign guys and bring guys in like Braden Smith and Wyatt Teller. But at some point, you just got to be sure that these young draft picks work out. And you got to be able to manage this roster through the next 3 years while facing increasing cap costs on a defense that hopefully is still awesome, but has a lot of guys they got to pay, a couple guys that they might have to say goodbye to at some point. That's probably a good topic for a future episode. Just simply, hey, who are the guys who's the guy that's first going to rip your guts out when they have to say, sorry, you know what? We can't pay him. The Texans had to do that back in the day with Mario Williams and Eric Winston. Remember, after the Texans got good, all of a sudden, boy, we got too many. We got to pay Arian Foster. We got to pay all these other guys. They couldn't hold on to guys like that. And the Texans aren't there yet, but it's coming. It's coming down the pike. So the level of urgency, just from a business standpoint, has gotten that much higher. So those are my 12 lingering concerns. None of them, I implore you, don't go on the Twitter sphere and say that Seth Payne thinks the Texans suck or anything. It's just the stuff that any football coach or GM is going to continue to worry about because they're wired to worry about stuff and always want to be tweaking. Thanks for watching or listening to the Believe in Texans podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. If you're listening on Apple, please give us a 5-star review and a nice comment. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button and subscribe. Everybody have a great day.